In a quiet neighborhood where every rule is controlled by the HOA, one man stood against them all. It started with nothing more than a tree, but that tree would spark a war no one could ignore. The neighborhood always seemed perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns stretched in neat rows, driveways were spotless, and the fences were painted in HOA-approved shades of beige. Each morning, sprinklers danced across the yards, ensuring no blade of grass grew too tall and no flower dared to bloom out of place. To a casual passerby, it looked like the kind of suburban dream people worked their entire lives to achieve. But under this calm order, the quiet hum of conflict was waiting. At the center of this neighborhood lived Thomas Hale, a retired school teacher who had purchased his modest home over 20 years ago, long before the current HOA even existed. His backyard held something the other homes did not: a towering oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, providing cool shade in the blazing summer and a home for countless birds that sang at dawn. Children loved to play under its leaves, and neighbors often admired its beauty. For Thomas, the tree wasn't just part of the property. It was part of his identity. It was a living memory of his late wife, who had planted flowers around its roots and spent hours resting beneath its shade. For years, the tree stood without complaint. But the peace was never meant to last. The new HOA president, Marjorie Collins, had moved into the community only 3 years ago. Known by many simply as the Karen of the block, she prided herself on perfection. To her, the tree was not beautiful. It was a nuisance. It shed leaves in the fall, which sometimes drifted into the yards of nearby homes. Its roots pushed gently against the edge of the sidewalk, creating a minor bump that nobody truly cared about. Nobody except Marjorie. She saw it as an offense, a violation, and most importantly, an opportunity to assert her authority. At first, her actions were subtle. A stern glance toward Thomas when she walked her dog past his yard. A complaint about the shadows cast on her garden, though her property was 2 houses away. Then came the first letter, carefully typed and delivered in a crisp white envelope bearing the HOA's seal. It spoke of community standards and unapproved natural structures. Though it didn't name the tree directly, Thomas knew exactly what the words meant. The HOA wanted it gone. Thomas dismissed the letter, hoping it was nothing more than posturing. After all, the tree was older than the HOA itself. Surely they couldn't force him to cut it down. He had seen neighbors change paint colors and fix fences under the HOA's scrutiny. But this tree, this living monument, was different. But the second letter came soon after, this time bolder, with mention of fines. It claimed the roots posed a safety hazard and the branches were unsightly. Then came the third, threatening legal action. Neighbors began whispering. Some shook their heads in sympathy, others kept their distance, unwilling to challenge the HOA's growing power. Marjorie, meanwhile, smiled at every gathering, presenting herself as the hero of order, the savior of property values. While behind the scenes she was tightening the noose around Thomas's quiet life. As the pressure mounted, Thomas felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. He walked into his backyard one evening, listening to the soft rustle of the leaves above. The sun dipped behind the branches, casting long shadows across the grass. This was the same view his wife had loved, the same sound that had comforted him on lonely nights. The idea of losing it felt like losing her all over again. The HOA wasn't simply asking him to cut down a tree. They were asking him to surrender a part of his soul. But Marjorie was relentless. Soon, she began rallying the HOA board, convincing them that if they allowed Thomas to keep his tree, it would open the door for others to defy the rules. A slippery slope, she called it. To her, it was not about the tree anymore. It was about control. The battle lines were drawn. What began as a simple letter had now transformed into something far more dangerous. The HOA was preparing for war, and Thomas would have to decide whether he was willing to fight for the tree that had become more than wood and leaves. It was history, memory, and defiance, all wrapped in one. As summer turned to fall, the leaves began to drop, scattering across lawns and sidewalks. Each leaf felt like a silent message. The fight had only just begun, And so, in the heart of a seemingly perfect neighborhood, the seeds of conflict were planted, seeds that would grow into one of the fiercest battles the HOA had ever faced. This was not simply about a tree. It was about power, pride, and the lengths people would go to control others. And for Thomas Hale, it was about survival, not of his home, but of everything that made it truly his. The first sign that things were about to get worse arrived quietly, tucked into Thomas's mailbox between a grocery flyer and a utility bill. It was a notice, short, sharp, and designed to sting. The HOA claimed that leaves from Thomas's oak tree had been found in multiple neighbors' yards. The letter described them not as a natural occurrence, but as a violation of the community's cleanliness standards. It went on to warn that repeated offenses could result in fines. Thomas read the letter twice, shaking his head in disbelief. Leaves? The same leaves that fell every autumn in every yard of every street? How could nature itself be a violation? He folded the paper and left it on his kitchen counter, thinking it too absurd to take seriously. Surely this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. Within a week, another notice arrived. This time, the complaint was that the tree's roots were distorting the uniformity of the community sidewalks. The bump they referred to was so small, most people wouldn't even notice it. A child could run across it without tripping, yet to the HOA it was suddenly a looming hazard. The letter warned of potential liability, painting Thomas as a danger to his neighbors. Marjorie had found her weapon. What made matters worse was how quickly whispers began spreading. Neighbors who had once stopped to chat with Thomas now passed by with polite but distant nods. Some avoided eye contact altogether. It wasn't just the letters anymore, it was the quiet shift in the air. The way people began to see him not as a friendly old teacher with a beloved tree, but as a stubborn holdout, someone causing problems. And still, the letters came. One accused the tree of casting shadows across a neighbor's solar panels. Another claimed that falling acorns posed a slipping hazard in the street. Every week seemed to bring a new notice, each more absurd than the last, until Thomas had collected a small stack of them on his desk. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't going to stop until he gave in. At first, Thomas tried to reason with himself. Maybe if he ignored them long enough, they would get tired. Maybe if he trimmed a few branches, the complaints would fade away. He even paid for a local landscaper to prune the oak, spending money he couldn't easily spare. But even after the careful trimming, another letter appeared, this time accusing him of failing to maintain the aesthetic balance of the canopy. It became obvious. The HOA didn't want compromise. They wanted the tree gone. For Thomas, the strain began to seep into his daily life. He stopped enjoying his walks through the neighborhood, knowing Marjorie might be lurking with her phone, snapping photos for evidence. He grew hesitant to invite friends over, worried they would be caught up in the HOA's cold stares. Even his quiet evenings in the backyard felt different, the once peaceful rustle of leaves now carrying the weight of looming threats. Then came the first fine, a crisp envelope delivered with authority, stamped with bold red letters, Notice of Assessment, $100 for failure to address recurring violations. Thomas sat at his dining table, the notice trembling in his hands. He had lived in the same house for decades, paid his dues, maintained his home with pride. And now he was being fined for keeping a tree that had stood long before the HOA was even founded. The fine wasn't what hurt most. It was the principle. Behind closed doors, Marjorie celebrated her progress. At board meetings, she spoke with passion about upholding standards and protecting property values. To her loyal followers, she painted Thomas as a reckless neighbor whose negligence threatened them all. Each story twisted, each detail exaggerated until the tree had become a villain in itself, and the board listened. Whether out of fear of Marjorie or out of genuine belief in her cause, they nodded along, authorizing more letters, more warnings, more fines. But not everyone agreed. A few neighbors still remembered the kindness Thomas had shown over the years. The way he shoveled snow from their sidewalks in winter, or the times he shared apples from the tree's branches with neighborhood children. Quietly, they whispered words of support when they saw him, telling him to hold on, to fight back. But their voices were soft, drowned out by the louder chorus of the HOA's demands. As the fines piled higher, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. He could give in, cut down the yoke, and make the pressure vanish. Or he could resist, and risk losing more than just money. Late one evening, as the autumn wind rattled the branches above him, Thomas stood beneath the tree. Its massive trunk seemed unshakable, its roots dug deep into the earth as though defying the very idea of removal. He ran his hand across the rough bark, remembering the years of shade, the laughter of children, the comfort it had given his wife. No, he thought, this isn't just a tree, this is a line in the sand. The HOA wanted compliance. Marjorie wanted power. But Thomas Hale was ready to give them neither. The complaints were only the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. By the time winter crept into the neighborhood, the conflict had grown far beyond scattered leaves and falling acorns. What began as quiet complaints had turned into a full-scale campaign, orchestrated with precision by the HOA board under Marjorie's leadership. The letters no longer carried polite warnings. They were sharp, blunt, and coated with threats. The fines increased steadily, $200, then $500. One letter even claimed that if the tree was not removed within 30 days, the HOA would pursue legal action and seek reimbursement for damages to community property. For Thomas, it was as though his quiet home had been transformed into a battlefield. Every envelope in the mailbox felt like another bullet fired in Marjorie's war. Soon, the fight left the page and moved into the boardroom. The HOA announced a special meeting, scheduled for a Thursday evening with the tree at the top of the agenda. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some attended out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to Marjorie, and a few, just a few, out of sympathy for Thomas. The meeting hall was sterile, brightly lit, and filled with the faint smell of coffee and paper. At the front sat the board, Marjorie at its center, her posture stiff, her expression set in stone. She spoke with rehearsed authority, declaring that the oak tree was not just unsightly, but a danger to the entire community. She listed her accusations one by one: cracked sidewalks, obstructed light, falling debris, lowered property values. Each claim more exaggerated than the last, each word designed to sway the room against Thomas. When his turn came to speak, Thomas stood with quiet dignity. He did not raise his voice. He simply explained that the tree had stood for decades without issue, that it was healthy, and that it posed no real danger to anyone. He reminded the room of its beauty, of the life it brought to the neighborhood, and of how it had been there long before the HOA ever formed. But his words fell into a sea of silence. Some nodded gently, but most kept their eyes lowered, unwilling to defy Marjorie's glare. When the board voted, the outcome was, as Thomas expected, unanimous. The HOA declared the tree a violation, and the order for its removal was officially recorded. The wrath of the HOA had become law within the community. For Thomas, it was a crushing blow. The fines continued to arrive heavier and more aggressive. Notices threatened liens against his home if he did not comply. The HOA's newsletter, once filled with recipes and community updates, now carried subtle warnings about residents who failed to uphold the values of the neighborhood. Though his name was never printed, everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. The pressure was suffocating. Some neighbors avoided him altogether, fearful of becoming targets themselves. A few still whispered words of encouragement, but none dared to speak publicly in his defense. Even the children who once played beneath the tree were pulled away, warned by their parents to keep their distance. Marjorie had what she wanted: isolation. Thomas was being painted as the villain, the holdout, the one dragging the community down. But Thomas was not ready to surrender. He began researching. Late into the night, he pored over property deeds, local ordinances, and legal precedents. The oak tree, he discovered, was older than the HOA itself. It had been marked on property surveys long before the association had jurisdiction over landscaping. There were even protections for heritage trees within the county, laws that might shield it from arbitrary removal. For the first time, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope, but hope alone could not stop the HOA's wrath. The board escalated its threats, scheduling contractors to forcibly remove the tree if Thomas did not comply. They tacked notices to his door, warning that the costs of removal would be charged directly to him. Every step they took was meant to break him, yet with every threat, his resolve only grew stronger. Standing in his backyard, the bare branches of winter stretching above him, Thomas made his choice. He would not cut the tree. He would not bow to the HOA's bullying. If they wanted war, they would have it. And so, the conflict that had begun with a single complaint about fallen leaves was about to reach a far more dangerous level. The HOA board had declared war on Thomas Hale, and Thomas was ready to fight back with everything he had. The wrath of the HOA had been unleashed. But so too had the quiet strength of one man who refused to be broken. Winter passed slowly, and by the time the first buds of spring appeared on the oak tree, Thomas knew the HOA would not stop. The letters, the fines, the notices, they had all been weapons meant to wear him down, to force him into surrender. But instead of breaking him, they hardened him. The oak tree stood tall and resolute, its branches sprouting new leaves in defiance of every threat. And Thomas, standing beneath it, felt that same resilience growing inside himself. The final straw came in March. Another notice, nailed directly to his front door this time, announced that the HOA had scheduled a contractor to remove the tree within 30 days. If Thomas resisted, the cost of removal and legal fees would be billed directly to him, and failure to pay could result in a lien on his property. The message was clear: comply or risk losing everything. For the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself to feel anger, not just frustration or disappointment, but pure, righteous anger. He had watched his reputation erode, his friendships fade, and his peace of mind vanish, all because of one woman's obsession with control. Enough was enough. That very evening, Thomas called a lawyer. The attorney, a calm man with decades of experience in property disputes, listened carefully as Thomas explained the situation. When Thomas finished, the lawyer leaned back and sighed. "This isn't about safety, and it isn't about property values," he said. "This is about power. But I think you've got a strong case." For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the heavy weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The fight became official. Legal documents were filed, citing the tree's age, its presence on original property surveys, and county ordinances protecting heritage trees. The lawyer even found records showing that the HOA's authority over landscaping was limited to structures and modifications, nothing in their bylaws, gave them the right to demand the removal of a naturally existing tree. It was a turning point. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that Thomas had hired legal counsel. Reactions were divided. Some neighbors whispered admiration, impressed by his courage. Others shook their heads, muttering that it would only drag the community into unnecessary conflict. And then there were those who remained firmly behind Marjorie, repeating her warnings about liability and declining values, as though they were gospel. But Thomas didn't care anymore. For too long he had fought alone. Now he had the law on his side, and slowly, quietly, support began to surface. A young couple down the street slipped a note into his mailbox, thanking him for standing up to the HOA because they, too, had been harassed over minor issues. An elderly neighbor brought him cookies and whispered that she was rooting for him. Little gestures, small moments, but they reminded Thomas that he was not entirely alone. The HOA, however, doubled down. At the next board meeting, Marjorie stood before the room and declared Thomas a threat to the neighborhood. She spoke of financial risks, lawsuits, and property values, stoking fear among the residents. She promised that the board would not back down, no matter what legal tricks Thomas tried. But beneath her confident words, cracks began to show. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't signed up for a legal war. They wanted order and control, not courtrooms and lawyers. Yet Marjorie's will was iron, and her grip on the board remained firm. The neighborhood became divided. Signs of quiet rebellion appeared. Some residents stopped attending meetings, others muttered discontent at the rising legal fees being funneled into the fight. The unity Marjorie had once boasted about was slipping. Meanwhile, Thomas found strength in the very thing they wanted to destroy. Each morning he sat beneath the oak tree with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight filter through its leaves. It reminded him of why he was fighting, not just for himself, but for the principle that no one, not even a self-important HOA president, had the right to strip away his history, his peace, his home. The legal battle loomed closer, and as court dates were set, tension in the neighborhood thickened. The HOA sent yet another notice threatening daily fines until the case was resolved. But this time, Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. Now that he had evidence, allies, and, most importantly, resolve. The homeowner, who had once been cornered and alone, had chosen to stand tall, like the tree itself. And as spring turned to summer, Thomas knew the real showdown was about to begin. The courtroom would decide not just the fate of his oak tree, but the balance of power in the entire neighborhood. The HOA had declared war. Now, Thomas was fighting back. The courthouse stood tall and intimidating, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. For Thomas, each step felt heavier than the last. The fight that began with a few falling leaves had led him here, to a courtroom where the future of his home and his beloved oak tree would be decided. Inside, the air was cold and serious. Wooden benches lined the room, and the faint creak of shoes echoed across the floor. At the front sat the judge, calm and unmoving, a silent figure of authority who would hear both sides and pass judgment. On one side sat Thomas with his attorney, papers neatly organized, evidence carefully prepared. On the other side sat the HOA board, led by Marjorie Collins herself. She wore confidence like armor, her expression smug, as though the outcome was already written in her favor. Behind her, a few loyal neighbors filled the benches, whispering support. But scattered among them were others, quiet observers who were simply curious, or secretly hopeful that Thomas would win. The case began with the HOA's attorney. He spoke of danger and liability, of sidewalks cracked and property values endangered. He painted the tree as a menace, an uncontrollable force that threatened the safety of the neighborhood. Every sentence was sharpened to cut down Thomas's credibility, to turn him from a neighbor into a negligent villain. Marjorie nodded along with each word, her eyes never leaving Thomas. To her, this was more than a legal battle. It was personal. Then came Thomas's turn. His lawyer rose with calm confidence, laying out the facts one by one. The tree was older than the HOA, protected under county ordinances, and included in the original property surveys. Photographs showed the roots to be stable, the sidewalk cracks minimal, and the branches pruned and well-maintained. Expert testimony confirmed that the oak posed no real danger. Piece by piece, the foundation of the HOA's case began to crumble. But the real blow came when Thomas's lawyer revealed evidence gathered from public records. Marjorie herself, the fierce protector of HOA rules, had made unauthorized modifications to her own property. An extended deck that violated setback rules, landscaping changes done without approval, and even a shed built on common land. The irony was undeniable. The very woman demanding strict obedience had broken the same rules she claimed to defend. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even some of Marjorie's loyal followers shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. For the first time, the cracks in her confidence were visible. The judge listened patiently, weighing each argument. His face revealed nothing, but his questions were sharp, cutting through exaggeration and demanding clarity. The HOA's claims, once delivered with certainty, now seemed weak, flimsy, and desperate. Thomas's evidence, steady and factual, stood strong. After hours of testimony, the room fell silent as the judge prepared his ruling. Thomas sat with his hands folded, heart pounding, every muscle tense. This was it. Months of letters, fines, threats, and sleepless nights, all leading to this moment. The judge spoke clearly and firmly. The oak tree was not a violation. It was protected by law and could not be removed by the HOA. The fines were invalid, the threats unlawful. The HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement actions against Thomas. And furthermore, they were required to reimburse him for legal fees incurred during the fight. The words struck the room like thunder. Marjorie's face drained of color, her lips tight as though she had swallowed poison. She tried to protest, but the judge silenced her with a stern glance. The battle she had waged with such ferocity had ended in complete defeat. For Thomas, the weight lifted instantly. The oak tree was safe. His home was safe. And for the first time in months, he felt peace return to his chest. He looked toward the courtroom window, where sunlight streamed in, a reminder of the same light that filtered through the leaves of his tree at home. But while the legal fight was over, the war within the neighborhood was just beginning. The HOA's authority had been shaken, its president humiliated, and its members divided. The aftermath would reshape the community forever. And as Thomas left the courthouse, stepping into the bright afternoon air, he knew one thing with certainty. He had stood his ground and won. But victory, he realized, was only the beginning. The courtroom battle had ended, but its echoes lingered long after the judge's gavel struck wood. News of Thomas's victory spread quickly through the neighborhood, whispered from porch to porch, carried across freshly cut lawns, and shared at backyard fences. For the first time in months, Thomas's name was not spoken with suspicion, but with admiration. The oak tree, once painted as a menace, now stood as a symbol. Its branches, heavy with new leaves, seemed to stretch wider than ever, basking in triumph. Neighbors who had avoided Thomas now slowed as they passed his yard, some offering quiet smiles, others small nods of respect. A few even stopped to thank him, their voices hushed, as though afraid Marjorie might still be listening. But Marjorie's power was broken. In the days following the ruling, she tried to maintain control. She sent out newsletters insisting the HOA would continue to uphold the highest standards. She attempted to frame the loss as a misunderstanding, a minor setback. Yet the facade was thin, and the cracks showed more each day. Board members who had once voted unanimously with her began to distance themselves. Some resigned quietly, unwilling to face the mounting frustration of their neighbors. Others stayed but refused to support her proposals, leaving her isolated at the head of a shrinking table. Whispers of discontent grew louder. Residents questioned why their dues had been spent on legal battles instead of community improvements. They demanded answers, asked for accountability, and in private, many admitted what they had once been too afraid to say aloud. Marjorie had gone too far. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. The room was fuller than it had been in years, neighbors packing the seats, their eyes fixed on the woman who had led them into disaster. Marjorie stood at the podium, her voice sharp, insisting she had acted in the best interest of the community. But the crowd was not swayed. One by one, residents stood to speak, not with anger but with exhaustion. They spoke of fines for trivial issues, of harassment over flower beds, of being photographed without consent. They spoke of fear, of division, of a neighborhood that no longer felt like home. And they spoke of Thomas, the man who had endured it all and stood his ground when no one else dared. By the time the meeting ended, a motion had been introduced, a vote of no confidence in Marjorie Collins as president of the HOA. The vote was overwhelming. Her reign was finished. Marjorie left the room with her head held high. But everyone saw the truth in her eyes. She was defeated, her authority gone, her power stripped away by the very people she once controlled. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The new board, humbled by the ordeal, promised transparency and fairness. They repealed many of the stricter rules, focusing instead on cooperation rather than control. The atmosphere shifted, smiles returned. Conversations bloomed, and for the first time in years, the community began to feel like a neighborhood again. And at the heart of it all stood Thomas's oak tree. Children once again played beneath its branches, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other across the grass. Birds filled its canopy, their songs carrying through the air. Neighbors gathered in its shade during warm afternoons, the tree becoming not just a landmark, but a gathering place, a reminder of resilience. of unity, of justice hard won. For Thomas, victory was not about pride. It was about peace. Each morning he sat beneath the tree with his coffee, watching the light shift through the leaves, remembering his wife, remembering the fight, and feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had not been broken. The HOA had tried to strip away his history, his comfort, his dignity. But in the end, it was their power that crumbled, not his resolve. And so the oak tree stood, not just as wood and leaves, but as a monument to defiance, to truth, and to the unshakable strength of one man who refused to bow to tyranny. In a neighborhood once defined by control, it was now the tree and the man who saved it that defined freedom. The war was over. Justice had prevailed, and the tree still stood tall.